with that, I think we'll open the floor to Scott, to say a few words, just kind of setting up, sort of what you're presenting us, and then we'll turn to Jeremy to start off the questioning, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that nice introduction, although it contained a few errors. One is that I did not go all over the world. I only went to Western Europe. Secondly, there's no archival stuff at all. It's only solely based on printed sources, partly so I could do this while also parenting what were at the time that I conceived this project, 2 small children. Now they're teenagers, but that's a different story. And this isn't actually a chapter. This is scattered, this is bits and pieces all dealing with coffee, sort of lumped together, taken from the book as a whole. So I'm looking at 7 drugs and 7 drugs in the modern period, which are they're coffee and tea, tobacco and chocolate, sugar, opium, and distilled spirits like gin. And I have the thing set up thematically. There are 6 sort of themes, main points I want to make in the book. And I decided the best way to, or one way to do it, the way I chose to do it was to have each theme be introduced by a drug. So coffee is actually going to be just about the nerves, that chapter. But other, the sort of exoticism is going to be lumped into chapter 1 about chocolate, the medicalization of it, and also, which I don't get into here, addiction is going to be lumped into chapter 2, which is going to be focused on tobacco. Sociability, which is alluded to vaguely here with the coffee house, is going to be lumped into chapter 3, which is tea. And then, let's see, coffee is about the nerves. Then gin is going to be about the morality of the marketplace and whether or not it's okay to sell and buy these things. The last substantive chapter is sugar. A lot of you are familiar with the attempt to boycott sugar in the late 18th century in Britain as a moral, sort of crusade. But another sort of underside of that was to talk about the filthiness and the disgustingness of the enslaved people as a way to try and get people away from using sugar as well. Not at all an enlightened appeal, but with an enlightened goal. And that sort of that undertone of filth and disgust also goes through all of these things here. You see that here with coffee at the beginning of the paper as well. Opium I'm going to use for the conclusion, just sort of it sums everything up. So that's the book, and this is just an article that's already off to the presses, but because all this stuff touches on so many different parts of the book, I'm really very much looking forward to hearing what you all have to say, to suggest or to tweak or to attack me at, so I can take that into account while finishing the book. So thanks very much for coming here. I really appreciate you taking the time to look at this and to be here this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Scott. I just want to let everybody know I muted everyone who wasn't already muted. So if when it does come time to speak, please unmute yourself. But I did not mute Jeremy Popkin, who is our next speaker.
Thank you, Karen. Having taught my 2 classes already today, I feel kind of muted already. But I am giving myself a shot of caffeine, Scott, so hopefully that will help me get through. Scott has given us has just explained to us the relationship between this paper and his overall project. And I think we can see in this paper evidence of everything that Scott just said about his project. Certainly the breadth of his research, it may not be strictly speaking archival research, but he has cast a very wide net in terms of languages and different national cultures, but also in terms of the variety of forms of evidence he's drawn on, ranging from poems from Restoration England to medical treatises from 18th century France and Italy. And he also has brought in a very wide variety of different dimensions of the use of these exotic substances in early modern Europe. We're talking about their effects on sociability. We're talking about their medical effects. We're talking about a religious discourse about them and many, many other things as well. So I think we can see the broad interest of this project, and that Scott has succeeded very well in giving us a kind of coming attractions with the focus on coffee that will certainly whet our appetite for the tea, the sugar, the chocolate, maybe not for the opium for all of us. And you seem to be sketching out a kind of a chronology of the impact of these substances. Most of them come into European life with the beginning of what we used to call the age of discovery, and which I suppose we would now call the age of exploitation, with Europe increasing its contacts with other parts of the world. And there is at first a great concern with the exotic character of coffee and some of these other substances, that they may be dangerous to European life, that drinking coffee may turn you into a excuse me, a Turk or even a Jew. We had some references, and also, of course, with the unaccustomed characteristics of the beverage of coffee, its dark color, which could be associated with undesirable bodily products. And then we seem to see, as time goes on, and especially when we get into the 18th century, perhaps less of a concern with the potential religious significance of coffee, and more of a concern with its scientific effects, and particularly the medical effects on people who are drinking it. And Scott wants to shift the focus of the discussion of the impact of coffee from what he sees as a current of scholarship inspired by Jürgen Habermas's famous book more than a half century ago now, which emphasized how coffee facilitates a important change in patterns of sociability by accustoming people to meet in coffee houses, and to engage in discussions on a kind of socially egalitarian basis. And as the title of his paper, Coffee and the Body, suggests, Scott wants to redirect our attention to concerns about the physiological effects of coffee consumption, and how people react to that. So he sees, he wants to kind of redirect the focus of historical attention in a new direction. I found Scott's argument generally convincing, and I don't really have any fundamental criticisms. As he himself indicates, his argument fits into a broader current of study of the growth of consumer culture in early modern Europe, and certainly adds to the general picture of Europeans spending more money on things that aren't strictly life necessities, nutrition and clothing and lodging and so on, but being able now to make some choices about expenditures that represent, to a certain extent, a rise in the standard of living. He references Jan de Vries's notion of an industrious revolution powered by the willingness of ordinary people to work harder in order to have more money and to be able to consume more goods. He also points to issues about what he calls another aspect of modernity in addition to consumption, which is what he calls the modern wellness industry, a increasing concern with regulating one's purchases and one's consumption with the idea of safeguarding and improving one's health, which he sees as characteristic of being as characteristic of modernity as the kind of social interchanges that Habermas emphasized. In his preliminary comments this afternoon, Scott reassured me that the theme of addiction, which is not particularly prominent in this paper, but which I know you and I have discussed when you were telling me what you were doing in past years, was going to be an important aspect of the project. And so I see that it certainly hasn't fallen out of the picture. It's just not emphasized in this particular paper that you have given us. But I did jot down a note that some of our earlier discussions had led me to anticipate that you might have given us versions of early modern discussions of the difficulties of coffee withdrawal symptoms, and whether the medical writers of the 18th century were already conscious of the fact of how hard it is for people to give up their caffeinated beverages. So that was one question I had written down. Did anyone describe the effects of trying to give up coffee drinking? I was interested that coffee does not seem to have been associated with warnings about dangerous or antisocial behavior, particularly the contrast with the gin craze, for example, or opium addiction. Nobody seems to have been worried that crazed coffee addicts were going to commit crimes, that they were going to neglect or abandon their children, or that they were going to lose their zeal for work, so that that may raise some questions about where coffee fits in this universe of mind-altering substances that you're treating in your overall work. Another question, you remark that governments didn't make much effort either to regulate coffee consumption or to profit from it. And I'm wondering how you would explain, we know in some countries there is a tobacco monopoly, for example, that becomes an important source of government revenue, but I guess no country tries to impose a coffee monopoly and benefit from the desire of the population to consume it. And finally, you mentioned in your preliminary remarks the role that sugar comes to play in anti-slavery discourse. That boycotting sugar is seen as a way of protesting against slavery. Coffee is also, by that time, largely a product of slave labor in the colonies, but I don't think there is as much of an emphasis on boycotting coffee as there is in sugar, and I'm wondering about the difference. I was wondering also about some of the implications of your approach for the history of medicine. It would seem that in this period, doctors' warnings about the dangers of coffee actually had little to do with its actual effects, that the dangers they were warning against, we would say with our supposedly superior modern knowledge, actually in most cases didn't exist. But I wonder, have we really escaped from this kind of thinking, or are we still, do mind-altering and addictive substances still have this ability not only to alter the minds of their users, but to generate perhaps irrational thoughts in the minds of medical experts writing about them? And is that maybe one of the lessons of your work that would still have present-day relevance? So I'll stop there, and let's see what some of our other colleagues and friends have to say.
Scott, do you want to start by addressing some of what Jeremy was asking, or would you rather open up for questions directly?
Let me just, I'll take on a couple of them.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
So like you mentioned gin and how gin was so associated with the disorderliness among the poor of London. For coffee, it leads to disordered sex. Women getting together in their coffee and tea parties. The Dutch especially were very worked up about this. You know that the women, it's just an excuse for them to get the men out and drink their coffee and tea and talk about sex and discuss how to get the men out of the house. You can have sex with people that you're not supposed to have sex with and all this kind of stuff. And then it's also, you mentioned with the gin is sort of making the working classes unable to do their job. Mm-hmm. There was a smaller strain of thought about coffee and tea as well, that you have these sort of wealthy farmers in southern England who are making enough money to buy coffee and tea for themselves and then to sort of wallow in luxury instead of drinking beer, which is what they should be drinking, which will strengthen themselves, and how this is going to corrupt both the morality and eventually the physical strength of the working class.
Okay, it's more dangerous than I realized then.
Yeah. As far as the monopoly, there was no coffee monopoly, but certainly they were eager to profit from coffee. One of the guys, I think he's in the thing we read for today, this article, is actually a booster for one of the Caribbean islands. He said, "Oh, we have coffee now. Everyone should drink coffee in the morning, not tea, because then we keep English specie within the English Empire. Sending it to China to buy tea, and it'll promote the colonies, that kind of thing." Although when you're talking about the boycotting, what they talked about, we talk about the sugar boycott. What they often talked about is boycotting the products of West Indian slave labor. Which meant mostly in their minds sugar, secondarily rum. So don't drink rum. But respectable people didn't drink a lot of rum anyway.
Yeah.
And so mostly it was sugar. There were coffee plantations in the Caribbean, and of course, that's why you're drinking sugar. You're eating sugar, is to put it into your coffee, your tea, and your chocolate.
Yes.
So there was one Dutch writer talked about when you stir, you young woman living luxuriously with your lover, in the morning you get up and you pour sugar into your coffee. Think about the screams of the children being taken away from their mothers, and how this gets to be made. So they're drawing that connection there, but they mostly focus on sugar.
That's what I thought.
But they're aware that it's all part of the same. Yeah.
I think I saw a hand. Sorry, I was muted myself. Francie, do you want to go ahead?
Okay, I'm on my iPad, so it's a little hard to manage the mute and unmute. Well, I really enjoyed this. Coffee is one of my favorite subjects, and I actually have written a few articles on it, but mainly from the production side, from how its impact in Mexico and how it's such a capitalist product. It really is responsible in many parts for doing away with the slave trade, because slavery turned out to be very non-capitalist for the needs of coffee production, and it brings in women and children in as labor. It's family labor. But anyway, I have a lot of questions, but I'll ask you two right now, which is, as I read this, I kept on asking myself, well, how are they drinking this coffee? What is this? Is it like the Turkish coffee? Or is it like the coffee we know today? Or how are they brewing it? What coffee are they actually drinking? Because when you hear that thing about the let's see, a broadside against coffee, or the marriage of the Turk, and I'm imagining the female Thames and the male coffee. Well, if it's Turkish coffee, it's very little water compared to a lot more coffee. So I was trying to think, what kinds of coffee at what point, or how are they brewed? Because coffee is brewed so differently than tea, and where are they getting the coffee? Who's grinding it? Who's toasting it? There's a really good novel. Do you know the novel, The Coffee Trader?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the other question was, I really felt like I needed more of a class analysis here, because I didn't feel like it seemed to be very tilted towards elites and middle class. And if I remember, it was Hobsbawm who said, and I didn't have a chance to go check this, he said that coffee fueled the Industrial Revolution because it got people up and it got them into the factories. So I'm just wondering from the other side, from the social class point of view, how are people looking at coffee and what's going on among the working class and the getting people into the factories in Great Britain? So anyway.
Yeah, good questions. Thank you. No one believes that anymore about coffee and tea and the Industrial Revolution.
Good to know.
It's still part of the diet of people. Sugar, really, the calories of sugar that they take with their coffee and tea is part of the sort of what makes it so that you can pay the English working classes in the 19th century so little. There's also been a new book out about coffee in the modern age and talking about how the coffee break comes along. Coffee and it is seen as like a something that's suited to the fast-paced life of offices and factories, but that's later. There's not a causal.
Well, let me ask you then. There's this enormous production of coffee in the 19th century, early 19th century on in Latin America.
Yeah.
So you're saying that's a middle class consumption?
In the 19th century, I don't know. I don't know much about. I think the 19th century becomes broad. So yeah, coffee at the beginning in the middle of the 17th century, it's an exotic thing for the virtuosi, these people, these educated, wealthy men who collect things from all over the world. Once you get coffee houses, it becomes cheap enough that tradesmen will come in and have coffee. And part of what the whole other argument about coffee and coffee houses is that they have to police it and make it acceptable for polite society. And one of the ways to do that is to exclude tradesmen with their ignorant views. They don't want them hanging out with Samuel Johnson and all those guys, Boswell. They want them to stick to their business and keep out, or come in and quietly listen. So it is cheaper, but it isn't, well, and by the end of the 18th century, it's cheaper. It's also becoming something that's drunk really more outside the coffee house than inside. So people are getting it for their homes and drinking it. But it's, again, sort of a middle class sort of thing. Tea is the thing that becomes much more in Britain and the Netherlands, something that working class people will drink. By the end of the 18th century, they're drinking that as part of their ordinary diet, not just as a treat once in a while, or a few people who like it, who spend money that maybe shouldn't spend on it. Tea becomes the cheap thing that everyone drinks. Chocolate is the more elite thing. It's really urban people only, and it's in Southern Europe more than Northern Europe. In Italy and Spain, people are drinking more chocolate than they are coffee and tea. It's more widespread, and but even there, it's not as, the peasants are not drinking chocolate. People by the late 18th century, smaller cities are getting coffee. That's about as far as it'll go. So yeah, the working classes aren't really getting any of this stuff except for tea in maybe the second half of the 18th century.
Well, it'd be good to put that in too.
Okay, all right. So what kind of coffee? Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. And people have looked at this. I mean, they have coffee cups that are not the tiny little ones. So I would assume it's more like coffee today. Although also, one of the things about coffee is that that's something that people said was great about a coffee house, just like today. You can go there, buy one thing of coffee and sit there and for hours without having to order more. So people aren't necessarily drinking too much coffee. Tea is something that maybe was more watered down. There's they call him the tea doctor, Cornelius Bontekoe. He was a Dutch physician who was hawking the tea's properties in the late 17th century. He said that up to 200 cups of tea a day was just fine for most people. So I have to assume that the tea is pretty watered down and maybe smaller glasses than what we would drink today. But yeah, it's people say that sort of thing. I need to look at it and put it in the book exactly what what this coffee was and the tea and all that kind of stuff, how strong it was. The good questions.
You haven't tried the 200 cup a day regime?
No, not yet. Maybe by the end of the pandemic, I'll be up there, but not yet.
Go to China. They keep filling up water in your tea leaves.
Okay, so I think next is Eladio. And Jonathan, I see your hand too, but Eladio has his hand up on using his the little hand raise thing. Eladio, Joe, then Jonathan and Phil.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Scott, I loved your paper and I found it really interesting, mostly because I don't really get coffee. But reading your kind of historical take on it is fascinating, and it helps me understand why people like coffee. Anyway, I was wondering, as you deal with sources in different languages, do you find, or have you found the challenge in dealing with concepts like addiction or exoticism? I'm wondering if those words or concepts have different meanings or weight or significance in different languages. I don't know if that question makes sense, but I'm just
No,
wondering.
it does. Yeah, it
Good
does. It's great. So there are some things that, because all these languages draw on Latin, they have some words that are the same. Like voluptuousness is pretty much the same word across the board, I think. It was just, I think yesterday I was thinking about your question exactly and saying, oh, I have to figure that out. But I was thinking to myself, voluptuousness is a word that goes pretty much across the board. But they had concept, when they talked about addiction, they didn't have a way to describe it yet. So my chapter on tobacco is all about how they could very easily figure out the medical properties of this, what it does to the body. They have the old humoral galenic medicine from the Greeks and the Romans, and they just apply that stuff to the new drugs that they're getting. So coffee is hot and dry, and opium is cold and wet. And well, they knew about opium back then, but they can get the sort of physical things into their way of thinking pretty easily. It translates pretty well. But when they have no medical language to talk about addiction, so they instead turn to the language of luxury, which again, that comes from the ancient Romans and Greeks. And so luxury is a term they use to describe this sort of people wallowing in luxury and how this is bad morally. And then but they can't get out of it. They also talk about vice, and they talk about bewitchment and enchantment as sort of like this supernatural power these things have. Slavery is another metaphor. And these, all these languages they take a lot of their vocabulary like this from the Romans, whom every educated person was reading, right? Anyone who was writing this kind of stuff grew up reading Cicero and Seneca and those people anyway. So that kind of language comes pretty naturally to them. In fact, I was just reading a couple of days ago, there's a French natural philosopher who was writing about tobacco in the late 17th century. And he was quoting Seneca and Cato and all these other people talking about, how, well, you shouldn't use too much of this stuff. That would be luxury and voluptuousness. Yeah.
Thanks.
Great, thanks. Joe, you're next.
Thanks, Scott, for this paper. I really enjoyed it. And also just building off of that last thing, addiction means enslavement, right?
Addiction means, there's someone who just wrote a dissertation about this a couple of years ago. So addiction means to become an adherent, to devote yourself to something.
Right.
And it was mostly applied to studying. So I'm addicted to studying. These people, who are in the universities or whatever. But it also meant other things. And it becomes the word we use to describe what we now call dependence, right? Dependence on substance dependence, but still in what we mostly all think of, if we're not psychologists, we think of addiction. Even NIDA, the government, what is it? The National Institute, I can't drug something, I forget what it is. They talk about addiction in their literature, but originally just means to be a devotee of something.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for the paper too. I had a couple of questions, one of which was very similar to Francie's question about class analysis, but I'm going to ask it in a slightly different way, since I think you answered it really well there. I was interested if there are bodies that are perceived to be fit for the consumption of caffeine, right? So most of the articles talking about ways in which caffeine distorts the body are kind of in negative lights, the ways that caffeine affects the body. But are there people, whether it's a class of people or a race of people, who are perceived to be fit for the consumption of caffeine? The other question I had is about competition from other kinds of soft drugs. And you've talked a lot about tea and chocolate and things like that too. But I was thinking about it kind of particularly in the context of Caribbean production in the time period, like in the late 17th century, was when the English take over Jamaica. There are cacao trees there, and they try to start cacao plantations. And they fail. They fail like dramatically, and then thereafter they move in and start planting coffee. And so I was kind of wondering if there is like a process of marketing, if coffee was kind of like destined to become this commodity that was consumed in the way it was, whereas chocolate's consigned to a status as kind of more elite consumption, or if there's things on the production side that kind of drive this particular marketing of coffee to a sector of society and allowing it to become the thing that it becomes. And if there's a kind of story, a way you could work that in a little bit, I don't know.
That's a really good question. I haven't seen anything like that. It seems to, no one really can explain why different groups of people in Europe like different kinds of, everyone smokes tobacco. There's no question that tobacco is universal, but why and sugar, well, sugar goes with the bitter hot drinks, but why chocolate stays in Southern Europe and tea, first coffee and then tea become the popular things in England. I don't know that anyone's really explained why that is. And I'm not sure it had to do too much with sort of this mercantilist worldview. People would write about how we need, especially like during the Napoleonic Wars, when the continent was cut off from the world, right? It was like, well, we don't have coffee anymore. Let's try like chicory and things like that we can get inside Europe. But even before that, people were saying we need to, like this guy, the booster for coffee plantations in wherever it was in the British West Indies. They're like, yeah, we need to, let's keep drinking coffee. Coffee is good. Coffee is British. We're going to keep our money inside the British imperial system. But there were also people, the Italians, a few people in Italy were saying, first of all, we can grow tobacco here. We don't need to buy it from the English. We also can grow poppies here. We don't need to get our opium from the Middle East. That we can grow poppies here in Italy that are just as good as the poppies, as the stuff, produce opium that's just as good as the opium that we import from abroad. So people were thinking in these mercantilist terms, how much it had an effect on what people were actually consuming. I don't think it had much of one. I haven't seen people do it. I haven't seen people talk about how, oh yes, now we all have stopped drinking this or we drink this other thing because it's not ours anymore. With the one exception of the American colonists who, of course, boycotted tea, and then the Boston Tea Party, all that kind of stuff. And then the boycott of sugar, but that was for moral terms, and it didn't really work. It was a big deal. People were into it, but there's a small group of people who are who stopped drinking sugar. People thought it was vile to drink coffee, tea, and chocolate without sugar. And they started drinking East Indian sugar grown in India, which I'm sure has some other horrible labor regime, even if it wasn't exactly the same as the slavery and the plantations of the Caribbean. But they thought of it as a better thing, and that it was more expensive. It failed. In the United States, maple sugar in the early republic, this is something, the product of free labor of white men in Pennsylvania and New York, we're going to tap these maple trees and sell the sugar, but the sugar was bad quality and no one would eat it. So these are pretty inelastic demands, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, as far as I can tell, but no one's really written about it. And I haven't really seen any direct evidence of that kind of thing. But it's a good question, worth looking into. As far as who's fit for caffeine is good for you. Like some people, these guys, even in the article today said, we should drink coffee every day. It helps the nerves. Or certainly people were saying that, even if the physicians were saying, no, don't do that. People for themselves decided this is part of my wellness regimen. I need to drink my coffee every day. And it has, I forget if it's hot and dry. So if you are wet and cold, you should be drinking coffee, I suppose. But there's the neo Hippocratic, I think, the air and water. We were talking about this the other day, right? This movement in the 18th century to the idea that you should only be drinking or eating, consuming things into your body that are grown in the climate that you are living in, that you're from, right? So it's only good for the people who are there. So chocolate, for example, there's a guy who said, well, chocolate is fine for people who live in hot climates like the Caribbean. And even if you're an English person who goes to Jamaica or Barbados, have some chocolate there while you're there. It's good for you because you're in that climate. But once, don't bring it back to England and drink it there.
I'm going to go ahead and let Abigail go because she said she had to leave soon. So I'll go ahead and let you jump the line there.
Well, thank you. And thank you to those who were ahead of me in the line. Just a quick follow-up, Scott, to this question, this language of voluptuousness and luxury, and also this question of addiction, and also maybe a larger framework. What I'm intrigued about is the possibility that the kinds of critiques you're seeing are actually a really quite new formulation or reformulation of older sumptuary laws. And it seems to me that this is happening in a really interesting moment in the early modern period where, and I'm just going to try out this idea, it's probably crazy, there's a really interesting pivot from critiques of luxury and consumption that are framed in a traditional religious framework to a new kind of critique that, instead of being religious, is really more about national interest or collective social interest. And whether these substances are getting caught in a discursive pivot that's a bit unsettled and a bit lumpy and a bit of work in progress. And the one suggestion I would make is that a lot of that language, you don't have to go back to the Romans. You don't have to skip over several centuries. You've got a continuum of language for many centuries about the vice of luxury, and that gets expanded into voluptuousness. And also the scholastics and others made such a distinction. They knew about habitus as a form of addiction, right? You've got vice and sin, which are particular acts or particular moments, but if you repeatedly get caught up in them and form the habitus, the descriptions are very similar to addiction. One recognizes them in that way. So if you can pick up on any of that mess.
I could talk about that for a long time. So first of all, there's a new book, not a couple of years old, by a guy who's a neuroscientist, saying he's attacking the disease model of addiction and saying it's not a disease at all. You know, just calling addiction a disease doesn't help us treat it. What it is a habit. And that sounds bad, but until you think about what a habit really means and how deeply ingrained habits are. And that's all it is, just addiction, even to heroin or whatever. It's a habit, and treating it that way then can also help you think about how to get out of the addiction, even to something like heroin. So this is all these ideas are still swirling around today. Some story less. So there were certainly, so as you were saying, this is the time in which the ideas about luxury are up for grabs. And there are people following the Mandeville fable of the bees thing saying, well, actually, luxury is good. And because it helps put people to work. So this is part of the debate about gin. Like, oh my God, gin is debilitating the working class. Gin is making us so our soldiers and our sailors are becoming enfeebled. We're going to lose to the French, or lose to, I guess the Dutch would also lose to the French. And our workers are incapacitated. Our industry is going to decline. That's one argument. Another argument is that, well, distilleries put people to work and it creates wealth. And it's no business of the distiller how people use his product. If they take a little bit of it, which would be fine, or end up drunk in the street, that's their problem, not the distiller's problem. There are people also who are defending things like sugar as, well, it's not a luxury at all anymore. It's a necessity. We're using these things now. Luxury, tea, coffee, sugar, these things are now a necessity. They were luxuries 150 years ago, but now by the end of the 18th century, these are certainly necessities because of force of habit. And habit and custom, not really habit, but custom is another word that they use to describe, people can't, once they start smoking tobacco, they seem not to be able to stop. Yeah, so this is all that stuff you're pointing out is definitely true. I really hadn't thought about sumptuary laws, but also it's another, tea especially, people were really upset when poor people were drinking tea. Really bad. They should be spending their money, saving their money on tea was seen just as bad as gin in terms of, the working class are spending their money on tea, they're neglecting their children, they're wearing rags, they're attacking their own health by not drinking something nourishing like good old English beer, and they should, they need to get rid of tea. This is bad for them. Yeah, tea is fine for the upper class, but not for the poor.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and I'm sorry that I have to run.
Thanks a lot for coming.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Jonathan Glickson next.
Thank you so much, Scott. I have a couple observations and then a sort of broad methodological question. Observations just from my work in Venice that I've never seen any documents, any concern with health or wellness in terms of coffee. What they're most concerned with are spies in the coffee shops, and women being. It's not so much that women are doing the wrong things, but they're seen. Women are there's a law in the middle of the 18th century that women are allowed in when they're allowed to be masked. So they come in masks. So you can't tell who it is that's talking to the wrong person. Yeah, right. It's very clear that it is primarily upper class, though it spreads to the middle class. The Goldoni play, the Bottega del Caffè,
right.
There. The poor people are still just in wine. It's all about wine. But the methodological question, because it's something I deal with, and I've had arguments with some of my colleagues, in relying, or the principal sources often being printed works. How do you deal with the idea that we don't know how many people read them, how many copies were made? I just looked at the Rambaldi, and there may be half a dozen copies around, maybe a dozen. So it's not as if, if you go out there and you see a book that's got hundreds of copies, every library's got it, people, it's spread around. How do we know? I mean, do we know, or and how much do their ideas tie into what was generally thought? It's hard
What do you mean by generally thought?
No, I mean, in other words, just because Dr. Rambaldi says this is what coffee is about,
yeah.
If 12 people read his book, then it doesn't mean much. And so I don't know how one answers a question like that. It's just a question that arises in my mind when I read things.
Well, that's a really good question, and I've dealt with that question by ignoring it, basically. So, but I mean, partly the answer is that there's a couple answers to that question. One of them is that these guys were citing each other. So if you're a Spaniard writing about coffee in 1753, you're probably going to take into, there's people that you're going to talk about what they said who also wrote about coffee. And some of these things, that's all, it's just a compilation of what other people wrote about coffee. And some of these things, they're arguing back and forth. This person's wrong about that. So there's the learned community of Europe is in conversation, and the same names turn up again and again. So they are aware of what each other are writing, these physicians who care about these substances. What did regular people think? Well, I think I need maybe to emphasize that, which is that they ignored the physicians. The physicians were horrified that people are drinking coffee every day, right? That people are smoking tobacco every day. We all know that coffee is, the tobacco is great for the lungs because it expels putrid humors, right? It makes you cough or sneeze them out. We all know that coffee cures cancer, or the tobacco cures cancer, but people shouldn't be taking this every day. Healthy people should not be taking tobacco or coffee or tea or any of these things. And you should never be taking this stuff every day. But that's what people are doing. So it becomes instead this, yeah, regular people are not listening to these people at all. They're just doing what they want. Voltaire, famously, his physician told him, you got to stop. He maybe drank 100 cups of coffee a day. I don't know. He was a big coffee drinker. His physician kept telling him not to, and Voltaire kept ignoring him. So there's that. I mean, yeah, it's an issue out there, but I'm guess what I've really been looking at these published sources as more for just like what did people who thought about these things seriously think about them? What was out there in the learned culture about these substances? Not so much that what did people think.
Sure. Well, that they answered each other. I mean, that they cited each other is good. That's what you need to say. I'm just dealing things often with they're never cited again.
Yeah. No. Well, there's a lot of stuff like that as well too. And of course, a lot of this stuff is this doggerel poem that people don't. I don't know who reads this stuff, but you know, some of this stuff does get cited back and forth. Yeah. And in terms of the coffee house, women are not invited in the coffee house anywhere in Northern Europe either, except as serving women. Women are drinking coffee at home. And the coffee house remains throughout the 18th century a site where people fear disorder, even though more and more people are drinking. Actually, the coffee house is a place where you can get tea or chocolate, newspapers, and tobacco. The coffee house isn't really that much about coffee. And people, if you want to drink coffee, you can drink it at home. The Dutch are very much concerned about women drinking tea and coffee inside their own homes in a female, a homosocial space. And what are they getting up to? The English were as well. We think of the idea of the tea party as this very civilized, very polite ritual where men and women get together who are members of the same family and close friends. They talk very politely about nothing controversial. It's a way to sort of strengthen the bonds of family and close friendship. And that's the image that people who were defending tea like to project. The undercurrent of it is that other people are worried that women are getting together and gossiping without men present. They're ruining the reputation of men. They're conspiring to have sex with people they shouldn't be. They're ruining their servants. They're in cahoots with their servants to get the men folk out of the house so they can drink tea and put gin inside their tea also. And then all this kind of stuff. And coffee similarly to tea. So in very much the same way that people had to make the coffee house, they had to defend the coffee house. And other historians have written about this, like, oh, the coffee house is safe. It's a polite space. We don't really talk about, there's no sedition here. There's no heresy. There's no women. We're going to try and keep the lower class people out as much as we can. They also had to defend the tea party and make it a safe place where none of that stuff that you were worried about is actually happening. It's just women serving tea and speaking very politely to one another, and men are there as well. How much of that is, what was really going on, we don't know. Probably a little bit of all of it. But thanks.
Thank you. Rachel Loudon next. Oops.
Okay, unmuted. Hello, everybody who don't know me. I'm a historian of science and food who has recently moved to Lexington, Kentucky. And Karen and Emily were kind enough to invite me to join in. I think, I love this kind of stuff. It's really close to my heart. And I think I'd like to follow up some of the other commentators by asking you to link some of these differing opinions that seem to come up in the discussion of coffee to underlying beliefs. And let me talk about two, nutrition and politics. The nutrition one is that in the mid-16th, 17th century, when all these new substances that you're talking about are coming into Europe, excuse me, can you get out? It's a time when the European diet of the elite takes a dramatic change, and it differs from the medieval diet. It changes the kind of sauces, it introduces fat-based sauces, it introduces cold substances, it introduces perishable substances, it introduces airy kinds of foods. And I think that can be linked very clearly to a shift from the Hippocratic humoral theory of nutrition to what you're calling the iatrochemical theory, the theory associated with Paracelsus and Van Helmont, that becomes very fashionable in the courts of Europe, and particularly in Paris and in London at the Royal Society in the mid-17th century. And I would be interested to know more about how this very basic shift in the theory of nutrition feeds into the reception of all these substances that you're talking about. It's very clear that at least in other foodstuffs, it makes a huge, huge difference. By the middle of the 18th century, you've got both theories in parallel and all kinds of mixtures. But in the mid-17th century, they're very distinct, and they're also linked to political and religious opinions. The new theories tend to be Protestant, and where political theory is concerned, it's even more complex. But if you move into the 18th century, and now I'll go on to the political thing, as was it Abigail said, you've got this huge debate in food going back to antiquity about a luxurious diet appropriate to the powerful versus a Republican diet. This was played out very strongly in the shift from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, to a Republican diet that is based on strong foods, hard foods, healthy foods, simple foods that avoid sauces. Right. The Republican view is that the doctors are all catering to the wealthy. They're titivating the wellness concerns, if you want to call it that, of the wealthy, but that if you really want a strong republic, you've got to forget the doctors, you've got to forget the sauces, you've got to forget the luxury foods, and you've got to go to eggs and bread and cheese and basic foods. Here, I think there's a great division in the 18th century, which you've just referred to in your last comments, between those who see, say, tea and coffee as sober and Republican foods versus those who want to see them as new luxury foods that are aristocratic. And I would love to see you trying, when you are quoting all these people, to see if there are some of these underlying currents going on.
Yeah, there definitely are. I haven't really paid that much attention to it, but they talk about a lot of times people will talk about something like coffee, and in terms of also, it's one of these bad modern things like putting a lot of sauces on food, and it's bad for you in very similar ways. Yeah, and so I guess what I need to do is read up on that kind of thing, because I haven't really paid much attention to nutrition, except in terms in how, if you eat different things, your racial, what they consider to be racial composition might change.
Yeah, everybody's a dietary determinist at this time.
Yeah, but this is it's definitely in their mind. I've been picking out the stuff about drugs and alcohol. It's definitely in their mind. So that they write this stuff, a lot of times, not everyone, but many of them will see it as part of this, all these bad trends of people who are using sauces and using snuff and drinking coffee, that sort of thing as well. Yeah. And the iatrochemical, and then the nerves become a big thing with luxury and the sort of all the stuff that I talked about in this article, but they tend to get mashed together in the writing. These maybe aren't the best minds of the 18th century who are writing this stuff about coffee and sugar and tea. They tend to sort of overlayer the new ideas about alkalines and salts with the old ideas of the humors, and then with the nerves, they put it all in there as well. So it all gets kind of mushed together when you read about the actual medical stuff that's going on. In a lot of them, it's a swirl of all the information that's there. And there were all some of the people who wrote about, I mentioned fad diets in the article, and some of the people who write about these drugs, like George Sheen, the famous 18th century, you probably know about him, right? George Sheen?
Yeah,
So is that how you pronounce his name?
I think so.
Okay. So Cheney, he was, for those of you who don't know, he was a celebrated physician who tended to the wealthy in London and I think maybe Bath in the early and middle part of the 18th century. And he himself was quite overweight, and he was, a lot of his patients were overweight. He was trying to help them lose weight, but also for their physical well-being, but also their mental well-being. He ended up advocating what we would today call a vegan diet. He called it nuts and seeds. But he also definitely thought you should not be drinking distilled liquors. And I forget what he said about coffee, tea, and tobacco. Certainly, he would have only advised them in moderation, not as some sort of daily thing that people would be, using all the time.
Thank you.
But they're all in the minds of the people many of the people that I'm reading, nutrition and these, what we would call today drugs, and they're much of the same sort of concern. And everybody thought these things are sort of they're not quite food, and they're not quite 100% drugs either, something like coffee, and they're on a continuum between medicaments and nutrition, or they're sort of in between. And there is a debate about chocolate. You probably know this, whether chocolate breaks ecclesiastical fasts. So if you're Catholic and you're fasting, is it okay to drink chocolate? Is it a watery food, or is it a thick drink? And so people argued about that. Yeah.
I see, Scott, the moderator seems to have disappeared, but I have a question that kind of follows up on that last comment. I was going to ask, did you look at any of the rabbinic responsa? Is coffee kosher, since it is not mentioned in the Torah?
Coffee is, yes, Jews are allowed to drink kosher. There's a guy who wrote a book about that I reviewed.
Uh-huh.
I attacked the book. I thought it was poorly written. Only later did I learn it was his last book. He was dying, and it was unfinished. They published it anyway. I wish someone had told me that.
Well, at least he never knew, right?
That's true. But anyway, so coffee. There's a whole book I can loan to you about how coffee is okay for the Jews to drink.
But there must have been debate. No Jewish decision has ever reached easily without contrasting opinions.
Trying to find,
Jews welcome coffee.
So it's all about the debate they had, and they ended up saying that it's okay.
Okay.
My apologies for my disappearance. They're putting in a new furnace, and I think they must have cut the electricity. And with that, they cut the Wi-Fi. So Phil, have you had a chance to ask your question?
No, people have been interrupting because the moderator cut out. So, so I'll ask by now.
Sorry about that.
Rich, thank you, Scott. Thank you so much for a really fun paper to read. Dare I say it went down like a good cup of coffee. It was rich and complex, yet mellow and smooth. And this is maybe more of an observation in search of a question, but I think there's a question somewhere in the observation. And that is that I'm struck by the dichotomy, not in the way you handle the material, but within the material itself, the dichotomy between the social and the somatic, or the social body and the physical body. And of course, by starting with Habermas, as one really kind of probably has to do, there's that social thing where he doesn't seem to care at all about the fact that people are drinking coffee because that's not what he cares about. But then most of the paper is medical opinion, which makes a lot of sense. Of course, medical opinion, dare I say, now probably as well as then, is pretty obsessed with the somatic, like obsessed with the bodily to the exclusion of just about everything else, right? And doesn't really concern itself with the social practices around consumption. And this is sort of, you were beginning to sort of get into that territory in response to, I think, Jonathan's line of questioning, which I find really interesting, and that is the circumstances in which people ingest. Because if those aren't taken into consideration, and a lot of experts don't, they often get it wrong. I mean, a great example that resonates with me is there's, at least to me, a great book about opium consumption in 19th century China. Of course, I don't know the Chinese literature. I wish I did. It was in English, and it was really about how a lot of opium consumption in late Qing China was moderate. There was an elaborate set of social practices around the consumption in most cases, but because at least among English language commentators, there was such an obsession with the deleterious effects of excessive opium consumption and such a fixation on addiction that their critique of it was heavily somatic, but to the extent it related to the social, the indictment against the opium addict was that this person was either an asocial being or an antisocial being. And this guy who wrote this book, which kind of spoke to me, is sort of saying, well, this is just completely wrong, or not completely wrong, but it really kind of misses out on the whole culture surrounding a lot of the ingestion of this particular drug. And I'm wondering if you probably talk about this elsewhere in your manuscript, but I'm wondering where that middle ground might be around coffee consumption in the period that you look at between
what do you mean by
social.
What do you mean by middle ground?
Somewhere between this binary of the Habermasian social sphere, where coffee is really an excuse to talk about something completely different. And this really close somatic analysis of mostly physicians.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, certainly every single one, the way I teach my drugs and alcohol course from 1492 to the present, every single one of these drugs disorders an old form of sociability and creates a new one. So for coffee, there's some of the stuff, the early satire about coffee, you have alewives and coffee men who are fighting over customers, basically. And like, oh, we should be doing this. The coffee is disturbing my business, but also sort of traditional sociability. And then you have this new weird sociability taking place in the coffee house. And tea is the same sort of thing. It's creating this new form of sociability around the new drug that is threatening to the old forms of sociability. And then you have to have people, you have to come and defend these things. The coffee house is good. Like it's not seditious. We're not talking about heresy. We're talking about polite things. Tea parties, all just fine. But the same thing is through, throughout European and U.S. history. You get, the saloon is this horrible side of terrible sociability in 19th century America, where working class men are going to get drunk. And then you get new places where you drink alcohol, like nightclubs and restaurants, speakeasies during Prohibition that then become cocktail lounges. And it's a new form of sociability. It changes all this sort of thing. Alcoholics Anonymous is it's a sociability built on rejecting alcohol, right? You get this group of people together who share their experiences, they talk to each other, and they bond over not drinking alcohol. And there was something called the Washingtonian Society in the 19th century that was similar. It's a working class men getting together in a tavern-like setting, but not drinking. But they were still all the fun things you can do in a tavern. You could, whatever, they're playing darts or gambling, whatever. They were still do that. They're also talking about their experience of rejecting alcohol. So, you know, even today, the little communities of people outside of the offices of people, of smokers, right? Every one of these drugs creates a new sociability that attacks an old sociability. It's sort of a framework. And the people that maybe it's a problem of me cherry picking, because a lot of the people who attack it for semantic reasons will also attack it for social reasons. That, you know, gin does these terrible things to the body, and it also does these terrible things to the nation. And they'll talk about when I order my book or this chapter, I order it by theme, and I take this passage from one author and put it over there, and this passage from the same author and put in this other chapter. I mean, if the beginning of this is more of a good representation of what people are writing most of the time, or at least a lot of the time, right? We get the people write about the coffee houses and coffee. They don't like the coffee, but they also don't like people mixing together in the coffee house. Both of those things are concerning to them. Brian Cohen and Habermas and Pincus and all these people have focused on the coffee house as a site of disorder. And I'm saying, well, it's also a site of bodily disorder. That the coffee creates bodily disorder as well. So that's what I'm emphasizing here. But the authors in the 17th and 18th century, I don't know if I could say mostly, but very often would have both of these critiques in their writing. Yes, this is terrible for all these reasons, not just one reason. But that's a really good point.
I mean, I'm just wondering if anyone is saying, well, you know, a little bit of coffee drinking is like a little bit of beer drinking, right? It's a social lubricant. Sort of like, is there an early modern version of wellness where these modes of consumption are ways of getting people connected to each other? Or is that just the way 21st century people think?
You know, they would talk, a very common theme was that the proper use of all these things was fine. It's the abuse. Of course, tobacco, gin, whatever, all these things are good as a medicine in moderation at certain times for certain people. But people just going out and willy-nilly taking all of these every day, that's bad. I don't think the people who defended the coffee house as a site that was actually orderly and not a problem, so don't stop worrying about it, everybody. I'm not sure they also defended coffee as a good thing to drink. I think a few people have said it stimulates conversation, but that wasn't a very, not a terribly common form of response. Yeah. That's a good question, though.
So I want to alert you in the chat. Jonathan, thank you for linking to an article about Jewish views on coffee. So that's in the chat. Do we have other questions? I would take the moderator's role, opportunity to ask a question if there isn't one on the table yet. Okay. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Brandon. You go first.
Everybody, for those who haven't met me yet, I'm a new postdoc in the department. So my question was actually really similar to Phil's, but it's about mind-altering drugs and coffee and social control. So we know that the 18th century, 19th century scholars tend to cite that as the move from carceral control to like body power and mind control. And I wonder how new consumption patterns like coffee and other drugs were impacting the state's ability or fear of being able to fully control the mind. Was like coffee ever subversive from the perspective of the consumer? Were people doing this as a way to ever consciously escape state control over the way their mind was supposed to work or the way they were supposed to operate, or any of the other drugs that you studied?
That's a good question. So there's a guy named Daniel Lord Smale who's written about debt in the Middle Ages, and how if you are in debt to someone in Lucca, or I forget what town he's looking at in northern Italy, and you can't pay, the person that you're in debt to can get the authorities to come and basically go into your house and grab your stuff and seize it until you pay off the debts, or they'll use it to pay the debts. But it's a very public thing, so it's humiliating to be shown to be someone who can't pay their debts, and to be have all your house invaded and have your stuff displayed on the street, all that kind of thing. And so it's what he focuses on is the emotional state of that, like the humiliation and the shame. And this is what people, someone who is owed a debt, uses the state to humiliate the person who owes them that debt. And so basically the state gets a cut of this. So it's sort of the state inserting itself into the emotional relationship between these people. And when you're taxing, in what I'm seeing in the 18th and 17th century, if the state is taxing gin and tobacco and all these other things, if people are using gin and tobacco, not necessarily to be subversive, but just to feel better about, the way we, I guess, think of these things now, take the edge off, right? If they're drinking gin or drinking coffee or smoking tobacco just to put themselves into a better state of mind, then the state is taxing their emotions in a sense. So I'm playing around with that idea in the chapter about gin, which I haven't gone back. I was just throwing a bunch of stuff on the page. I haven't gone back to like really work on it. But I think I might take a tack like that on it. And when I sent this off originally to Cornell University Press, I mentioned sort of briefly, like, this is the age in which Foucault and Elias and Weber and all these guys are saying that Europeans are becoming more disciplined, especially becoming more self-disciplined. But here's this way, all of a sudden we have addictive drugs that should be eroding self-control and eroding discipline. And I didn't know, I didn't really have anything more to say than that. But the press came back and said, that's really interesting. This is what we're all excited about. So now I have to somehow find a way to speak to that more. So yeah, that's a good question. And it touches on some important things that I need to think about more as I go and write this book.
Yeah, Jonathan?
Thanks. Jeremy just reminded me of something I was thinking of earlier and I'd totally forgotten. And I know you don't appear to move as far east as Germany in this, but the Bach's Coffee Cantata, I don't know if you know the text for that, and it talks about the girl has to have her 3 cups of coffee a day or she's no good, and it ends up at the end with saying, well, cats have to chase mice, and women have to have coffee. Mother had her coffee need, coffee gebrauch, coffee brauch. And her grandmother even had it, so of course the daughter will have it.
Yeah,
so.
There you go. So I had to learn Italian and Dutch for this project. It's already taken me 12 years. I thought that German, I'll stop at the Rhine, thanks. I could certainly include Germany and also Portugal, but as a practical matter, I stopped with the Dutch.
Well, the Germans also print in Fraktur, so you'd have to learn another alphabet almost.
Right. Yeah. So Bach's gonna stay out. I'm sorry.
All right. Thank you. Okay. So is there anybody else who wants to ask something? If not, I do have a question. So I, thoroughly enjoyed this chapter and this article. But one of the things that I was constantly in my mind thinking, well, what do doctors today say, right? Not necessarily that you have to necessarily talk always about modern medicine, but just for the reader to have an idea of, we know about some of these things, but to what degree does the anxiety about nervousness while drinking coffee to what degree does that overlap with modern concerns about caffeine, right? I mean, just like I'm sort of thinking in terms of in background terms. Do you give your reader some kind of, I don't know, baseline of what the modern medical science might say about opium or gin or caffeine or what? I mean, they wouldn't even have conceptualized it as caffeine. But anyway, that's my question.
My answer is no, I do not. I'm firmly planted inside the linguistic turn, and I'm not treating these things as actual physical things that have actual effects on the body, but only in terms of how people thought of them. Yeah. You think I should?
Well, I mean, because I mean, it raises questions in the in the reader's mind. Well, does coffee make you nervous? Of course it does, or at least or I don't know. I guess the in the places where there might be an actual reality to what is being said as opposed to they're making it up. I mean, we know when they're making it up, but we don't know when there's something that might actually be scientifically behind what they're saying, right?
I'm pretty loath to say that science can tell us what these things do. I mean, a lot of the language, a lot of the historiography about addiction, for example, it's very much focused on the disease model of addiction, and that's sort of teleological. When did this modern disease theory of addiction come about for? And and so someone originally said, oh, it was Benjamin, the guy who was the signer of the Declaration of Independence, a physician in Philadelphia. What's his name? Benjamin Rush. He's the guy who first said that alcoholism is a disease. Other historians came back and said, well, actually, there were British physicians who were saying the same thing earlier in the 18th century. And now also, so that's fine. But at the same time, it's like, well, I'm not so sure that alcoholism addiction is a disease, right? That the way we think about, I'm not sure that addiction, for example, is something we just don't have our minds around yet. And is it addiction? Is it dependency? Is it a habit? Is it a disease? If so, what kind of disease? Is the only disease that willpower is somehow part of how you become whole afterwards? These things seem to be up to grabs in the literature for today. So I don't want that would seem to be the most salient place where I should address how does this work with today? And what I'm going to say is that, I think this is, we're looking at the prehistory of addiction in a way, in a time that maybe this old model is falling away, and it can maybe help us think about other ways of thinking about what we today call addiction, sort of as a short term. That's going to be the place where I'm going to bring that up in terms of like whether coffee makes you nervous, whether sneezing while you take snuff is good for you or not, how that feels. I'm not going to get too much into that because it does seem like you're saying, Karen, right? It's somewhat obvious that, coffee makes you feel nervous in ways that getting through the different language they use can be a little bit similar. I do want to talk in my chapter about how filthy and disgusting all of these things were to its critics, how much some people would also talk about the pleasure of these things and the pleasure of drinking chocolate, the pleasure of smoking tobacco, and how this is part of the allure. At the same time that other people were saying that these things are filthy, some people were saying, well, these things are so intensely pleasurable, and describing that a little bit, not very much, and mostly in verse, but that there was some of that going on. Karen, are you still with us? I don't see you anymore.
Really? Am I not here?
Phil took up the screen. I don't know. Does that
that makes sense. That
defense?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yep. No, that makes sense. I mean, and I think that that makes sense to me, certainly. Okay.
Can I jump in just for a second? Like, it is something that we're all, as readers, most of us anyway, who drink coffee, like this is in the back of our head, right, the whole time. Like, this is a debate I have with myself constantly. How much is too much? Does it really make me nervous? I love it. So I don't know if there's a way you can trespass on this ground for the sake of just like readerly interest in it, without going down some rabbit hole you don't want to go down. But I'm all for like gesturing to, the president fixation on whatever if there's a resonance with what you're dealing with historically. So I would encourage you to go for it.
The other thing that's, of course, the big thing that's exploded in the last 20 years in terms of addiction research is process addictions that have nothing to do with any kind of substance, right? Gambling, pornography, internet, social media, that kind of stuff. And I don't want to have to all of a sudden go read about gambling at Versailles or in the clubs in London and that kind of stuff. That's not, I don't have time for that. Whatever process addictions might have existed in the early modern period.
They'll have to wait for after you learn German.
Yeah, I guess so. I just grabbed out of a chapter, the chapter on tobacco and health, a whole section of stuff about melancholy and how all these things were supposed to affect melancholy for good or for bad. And melancholy was a sort of a weird, for those of you who don't know, kind of a weird catch-all mental illness in the early modern period that we often think of as like a direct correlation with depression today, but it's not at all what melancholy meant. It included what we would call depression, but included a lot of other weird stuff that doesn't seem to have much to do with depression. But certainly people had opinions about what tobacco and coffee and tea and all these other things would be either good for or ruinous for if you had melancholy. Don't, use these things more. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have time for one last question, if there is one. Anybody want to go for it? Okay. Well, in that case, Scott, is there anything that you wanted to say to sum up, and that will close out this really fascinating and a wonderful discussion. Clearly the work is very, very valuable. If we've talked about it for an hour and a half nonstop, and raised so many very interesting points. So bravo to Scott, and thank you very much to Jeremy for leading the discussion. And Scott, I'll give you the last word if you'd like it.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks so much for coming here and giving these great questions. They're really wide-ranging questions which is exactly what I need for as I'm finishing up the book in the next however long it's going to be. So I'm really grateful for your attention to this work and for the questions you posed. It's very helpful to me. Thank you very much. And thanks, Jeremy, for leading it off with excellent questions.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And don't forget, next week, our next installment, we'll have Alan Fletcher and Kathy Newfont. And that's next week, same time. Thank you. Take care, everybody.